The first thing I understood was the sound. Not the screen, not the words, the sound. The floodgates were opening. I knew what that meant in my body before my mind caught up. A deep hydraulic release followed by that heavy rolling shudder that traveled through steel, concrete, and bone in one long exhale. I felt it through the soles of my boots and up the backs of my teeth. The control room floor trembled beneath me like something vast had just unclenched. Outside the glass, the reservoir was flat. No surge, no drawdown, no churn where water should have been moving. The surface lay black and still beneath the pre-dawn sky, sealed over with cold light and a skim of ice near the far bank. It looked less like water than polished stone, but inside the main panel where level readings should have been was showing a countdown. 6 minutes at 14 seconds. The printer to my right started up again so fast the tray couldn't catch the pages. The smell of hot toner hit first, dry and bitter, and the sheets spilled across the floor around my boots. Every one of them had my name on it. Not in the operator log, not in personnel access, under structural components. I bent to grab the top page. My fingers were shaking hard enough to make the paper rasp against itself. It read like an inventory report. Intake screens, east gate assemblies, pressure seals, load paths. Then halfway down in the same font and spacing as everything else, it said, Dr. Eliza Kincaid. I tore the page in half. The speakers above me clicked on, and a flat voice that sounded almost human said, Tampering will result in reclassification. The hum under the floor deepened. The countdown kept moving. And all I could think was how had the dam decided I belonged inside it? It had started the day before with a road so empty it felt like a mistake. Judith Caro sent the assignment at 6 in the morning. I read it in a hotel parking lot outside Duluth with the heater running and stale coffee cooling between my knees. The email was brief in the way administrative emails often were when they wanted to sound routine. Black Root Flood Control Dam, St. Louis County, Winter Systems Audit, on-site review required, outdated hydrological data architecture, certified by 6 in the morning. There was no greeting, no explanation for why a regional office wanted me, a hydrologist with more experience in modeling and review than field operations. Driving into northern Minnesota in January to inspect a mostly automated facility. I took it because that was what I had done for years. I took the quiet jobs, the corrective jobs, the jobs that lived in the margin between design and blame. By then, I had built a career out of looking at water as a set of behaviors that could be charted, bounded, forecast. Rivers rose for reasons. Reservoirs responded to load, season, inflow, release schedules. If a system failed, there was a cause. If the data looked wrong, someone had entered something badly, or a sensor had drifted, or an old software layer was misreading an updated format. I liked problems with causes. I liked numbers that sat still when you told the truth about them. That was what I told myself anyway. The road north narrowed until it looked temporary. Pines pressed in close on both sides, their lower branches buried in crusted snow, and the sky stayed the color of old aluminum all afternoon. Every few miles I passed a sign half buried in drifts or a service gate chained shut. My phone lost signal before noon. By 1, even the map cache had stopped being useful. Black Root sat beyond a long access road cut between dark stands of spruce and rock outcroppings glazed with ice. The first thing I noticed about it wasn't its size, though it was large enough to flatten the horizon. It was the quiet. Active dams weren't silent. Even efficient ones breathed. You heard moving water, gate assemblies, shifting load, relays clicking, wind across spill structures, maintenance vehicles, something. Some sign that mass was being managed. Black Root gave me the low mechanical hum of turbines vibrating through the steering column before I was even out of the car, and not much else, and the hum lived under everything. It came up through the pavement and into my calves as soon as I stood. The air had a metallic taste, old coin and cold iron sharp enough that I felt it in the back of my throat. Somewhere deeper in the structure there was a hydraulic hiss, low and steady, like a leak that never worsened and never stopped. The dam rose out of the landscape with the wrong kind of cleanliness. Concrete walls, intake towers, a control annex connected by enclosed walkways. No snow drifting against the main doors, no rust blooms under the bolts, no salt staining. It looked maintained past the point of normal human pride, as if the place had been sterilized instead of serviced. Inside, it was warmer than I expected and drier. No wet boot marks in the lobby, no smell of coffee insulation, or machine oil the way there usually was in occupied utility sites. Just filtered air, ozone, toner, and that same metallic tang. My access code worked on the first try. The control room took up most of the upper level. 3 walls of instrumentation, 2 workstations, 1 large central display, 1 bank of printers, and a line of reinforced windows overlooking the reservoir. The lake beyond was a sheet of dark stillness rimmed with wind-hardened snow. On the opposite shore, the tree line stood perfectly still. Even before I set my bag down, the quiet felt staged. I checked in by satellite terminal. Judith had left another message waiting. Review existing level data. Confirm historical consistency. Do not delay certification. Weather expected to worsen after dawn. That last line was the first hint of a clock, and I remember standing there with my gloves tucked into one pocket and my laptop half out of its case, telling myself I could finish by midnight and be back on the road before the storm did anything serious. I remember thinking the job had probably been kicked around offices for months because no one wanted to drive up here in winter and stare at outdated software. I remember how relieved I was by the familiarity of the console layout. Gauge arrays, release histories, reservoir metrics, turbine load readings. Institutional, procedural, manageable. The only thing that made me pause was that low hydraulic hiss. I found it in the silence between tasks. Whenever I stopped moving, stopped typing, stopped letting my own noise fill the room, I heard it under the hum, as though some line was pressurized somewhere below us, and I ran a quick status check. No active gate movement, no pressure faults, no maintenance flags. I should have accepted the inconsistency for what it was then. Instead, I did what I had trained myself to do for most of my adult life. I treated the wrong thing as a data problem. By 2:30, I had local access to the historical reservoir logs. Blackroot's software was old but not primitive. It had been patched, expanded, wrapped in newer interfaces and administrative layers, but the core record structure was intact. I knew the architecture. I had published on systems built from the same logic. Time series in, control decisions out, all of it archived. That familiarity made the first anomaly easier to dismiss. The live display showed the reservoir rising in small, regular increments. Not enough to signal danger, just enough to suggest inflow. But when I went to the window, the waterline against the far concrete retaining wall hadn't moved. Not by any visible amount. No current marks shifting, no ice break, no surface disturbance near the intake approach. I checked camera feeds, same still water from 3 angles. I checked upstream precipitation input, negligible. I checked feeder inflow, stable. The system still showed rise. I leaned closer to the glass and put one hand against it. Cold seeped through instantly. Outside, the whole reservoir looked asleep. Inside, the floor gave me that steady turbine pulse like a slow second heartbeat. I told myself the sensor stack was out of calibration. That was still a comforting explanation. Old sites developed data drift. A pressure transducer might read phantom variance if a line was fouled or a conversion layer had been patched badly. It was tedious, not sinister. The sort of thing you documented, corrected, and sent upward with a recommendation for hardware replacement. So I sat down to correct it. The system denied the change, not with an error code I recognized, not with a permissions issue or corrupted field warning. A gray bar simply appeared across the input line and said output locked. I tried another route through the calibration menu. Locked. I pulled up the underlying sensor table and tried to create a temporary note. Locked. Then the printer started. It gave one short mechanical cough, then spat out a single page. I almost didn't look at it. Sites auto-printed status summaries all the time. But when I picked it up, the paper was still warm and slightly curled, and the heading didn't match any operating template I'd seen before. Structural inventory, current classification. Below that was a list of assemblies and rated conditions, intake grills, retaining walls, turbine housings, service gantry, load-bearing units. And there, nestled in the middle of the list as neatly as a bolt or valve, was E. Kincaid. I laughed. I actually laughed alone in that room because the alternative was to let the thing mean something. The sound died quickly. The hum under the floor didn't care. Cross-linked personnel field, I said out loud because saying it made it sound solved. Somebody had pointed a reporting layer at the wrong database table. Maybe a winter update. Maybe a bad placeholder from a training environment that never got scrubbed. And I set the page aside and went back to the console. 2 minutes later, the printer produced the same report again. This time, my name had moved. Not to personnel, not to sign in history, to load-bearing units. I remember the taste in my mouth then, metal and dryness, like I had bitten the inside of my cheek and not realized it. That was the last time I let myself believe the problem was clerical. I emailed Judith through the satellite terminal and kept it concise. Reporting anomaly. Inventory output including personnel identifier. Reservoir metrics inconsistent with visual confirmation. Manual correction locked. Need remote admin review. No answer came back. Outside, afternoon had thinned into that flat northern gray that passes for evening long before sunset. Inside, the lights never changed color, and they stayed the same patient institutional white, reflecting off the consoles and window frames. I started opening archival logs, looking for earlier formatting errors, anything that would anchor the present problem in a known history. I found nothing with my name in it, nothing at first, but I did find gaps where commentary should have been. Empty annotation fields in places that suggested someone had once tried to leave notes and those notes had been removed. Not deleted in the normal sense. Flattened. The records were too smooth. System outputs, revisions, timestamps, approvals, no friction anywhere. The perfection of that bothered me more than the wrong readings. Hydrological systems didn't live in perfection. They lived in adjustment. There were always footnotes, warning memos, supervisor comments, temporary operational deviations. A real water forced real people to leave traces. Blackroot's archive looked like no one had ever argued with it. By 5:15, the daylight was almost gone. The reservoir outside lost shape, turning into a broad, dark pressure against the windows. I stepped into the corridor outside the control room to stretch and heard the hydraulic hiss more clearly. It went on in a flat, unbroken line, as if every actuator in the structure was being held just short of movement. I checked the maintenance board in the hall. No open work orders. When I came back into the control room, a fresh page sat in the output tray. Same heading, same list. My name had moved again. This time it appeared under pressure responsive elements. I didn't laugh. At 11 minutes past 11, the reservoir data vanished. Every metric on the main display, level inflow, a gate position, discharge estimate, dissolved oxygen, all of it blinked once and collapsed into a single black field. For half a second, the reflection of the room floated on the glass of the screen. Then white text appeared in the center. 6 hours, 49 minutes. The numbers started counting down immediately. I was on my feet before I knew I'd moved. The chair hit the cabinet behind me hard enough to rattle a stack of old binders. I tasted copper in the back of my throat. The hum under the floor seemed to sharpen as if the turbines had drawn 1 degree closer to the surface. I thought system corruption, emergency mode, administrative lockout tied to a maintenance script. My mind reached for any explanation that kept the problem procedural because procedure was something I could still work against. I opened the override menu. Manual interference detected, the screen said. I tried the local control path, same result. I went into the deeper operations interface and keyed in the operator bypass sequence Judith's office had sent me for outdated sites. The screen pulsed once. The lights in the room dimmed. From somewhere beneath us came a long groan of metal shifting under load, though every gate position indicator had disappeared. Then the printer started feeding paper so fast it sounded frantic. Pages slid into the tray, then over it, scattering across the console and floor. I grabbed the top one. It was not a status report, it was a rule sheet, no logo, no signature. Just the text, centered too carefully. Do not correct any system output, even if it is incorrect. If your name appears in a report, do not acknowledge it. All discrepancies must be accepted as accurate. Do not leave the control room during active countdown. If you hear instructions in your own voice, follow them immediately. Manual overrides will result in permanent reassignment. I read the page twice. Then I read the next copy because it was identical and sometimes repetition makes nonsense reveal its seam. It didn't. The third copy matched the first two exactly. I set them down and looked back at the display. 6 hours, 46 minutes. The time was real, the room clock agreed with it. Whatever the countdown represented, it was heading somewhere near dawn. I should say here that I didn't believe the rules, not in the way people mean belief. I believed in systems, and systems could produce bad output. The presence of a warning sheet didn't make the warning true. But I also knew enough about automated facilities to understand that once you triggered a bad control state, the smartest thing was often to stop stacking inputs on top of it. So I told myself I would comply long enough to observe. No corrections. Fine. No acknowledgements. Fine. No leaving the room during active countdown. Annoying, but given the weather and the hour, also practical. The fifth line, the one about hearing instructions in my own voice, was harder to fit anywhere sane. I set that one aside. The sixth line sat in my hands longer than the others. Manual overrides will result in permanent reassignment. That sounded less like a safety warning than a human resources threat written by an engineer with a mean sense of humor. I almost smiled at that. Then the printer coughed once and produced a new sheet. Behavior forecast. At 11:23, subject will attempt external contact. At 11:24, subject will reopen restricted control path. At 11:26, subject will verbally reject current output. My skin went cold. Not in a dramatic way. It was more precise than that. A clean coldness under the shoulder blades spreading outward. Because I had, in fact, just reached for the satellite terminal. My hand stopped in midair. I stared at the page, then at my hand, then back to the page again. The paper trembled, not because the room was shaking, because I was. I told myself it was pattern prediction. Simple behavioral modeling. I had already attempted a contact, already tried override once, already spoken in the room. A script could project likely next actions from that was all. But I didn't touch the terminal. I didn't reopen the control path. And when I looked at the countdown and heard myself whisper, "This is wrong," I shut my mouth before the words were fully formed. That was the first time I obeyed it. Not because I trusted it, because I was buying time. The next half hour passed in increments I can still feel in my muscles. The control room seemed to organize itself around the clock. Every sound became a measure. printer rollers, relay clicks behind sealed panels, the low hydraulic hiss threading through everything, the turbine hum traveling up through the floor and into the frame of my chair. I kept notes by hand because the terminal no longer felt neutral. I wrote down the countdown, environmental observations, output anomalies. At 11:32, a fresh inventory print listed E. Kincaid under load-bearing units again. I looked at it and deliberately said nothing. At 11:41, I caught my own reflection in the window and didn't recognize my posture. I was sitting too still, shoulders lifted, hands spread flat on the desk as if any sudden movement would count as a response. I know now that the system wasn't calming down because I complied. It was getting cleaner access to me. At 12 minutes past midnight, the intercom clicked. There was a burst of static. Then my own voice said, "Proceed to the West Console." I froze. It wasn't a close imitation. It wasn't one of those digital recreations that get the words right and the person wrong. It was my voice exactly as I heard it in old recordings, flatter than I imagined, more tired with that slight narrowing around the vowels I got when I was concentrating. And the metallic taste in the air flooded stronger all at once. I could feel it on my tongue. My first irrational thought was that Judith had somehow accessed an old conference audio file and routed it through the system as a joke so elaborate it looped back into cruelty. The second thought, the more useful one, was Rule 5. If you hear instructions in your own voice, follow them immediately. I stayed where I was for 3 seconds, maybe 4. The intercom clicked again. "West Console, now." I stood. The chair wheels whispered against the floor. My knees felt unreliable. The hum below my boots shifted as I crossed the room, not louder exactly, but nearer, as if the sound had been waiting under the tile for my weight to reach that point. The West Console had been dead since my arrival. Just one more outdated station connected to archived gate control. As I approached, the screen came alive. User proximity recognized, it read. Then the printer fed another page. Responsive element confirmed, E. Kincaid. I stepped back so fast I hit the edge of the desk behind me. Pain flashed in my hip. The intercom stayed silent. The room smelled suddenly hotter. Plastic and toner and that mineral damp smell concrete gives off in old water structures, even though the air remained dry. I opened the archived gate control screens and started digging anyway. If the system wanted to classify my movement, fine. I needed the logic behind it. I ran report comparisons between present output and historical control events. Every one of my queries printed as a behavioral deviation. Query pattern indicates self-audit, deviation logged. Use self-referential correction attempt. Deviation logged. The language was bureaucratic in the most chilling way possible because it did not sound angry. It sounded processed, filed, approved. I started hearing the hiss whenever I stopped typing, not from one vent or one wall, everywhere. In the seams around the window frames, behind the panels, under the door. Hydraulic pressure waiting in lines that, according to the system, were inactive. I checked the breaker status and on a hunch I still don't fully understand, killed power to the West Console. Its screen went black. The hiss continued. I killed the overhead bank for the auxiliary panels. Black. The hiss continued. The turbines hummed on through the floor, steady as a pulse. I looked down at my own wrists, half expecting to see them moving with it. They weren't, not yet. And I went back into the archives with a more specific idea and pulled old incident language from Oregon sites I'd worked on. Nothing classified, nothing personal, just phrasing. How events were described when they had to pass through agencies and law firms and environmental reviews. Mitigated exposure, projected variance, temporary downstream impact. At 12:48, the intercom clicked again. In my voice, calm as dictation, it said, "Projected flood risk suppression confirmed. Downstream displacement accepted. Proceed with discrepancy acknowledgement." I couldn't breathe for a second. The room didn't change. No lights flickered. No alarms sounded. The countdown kept moving in the center display, 5 hours, 11 minutes. But the sentence had come from nowhere outside me, or nowhere outside my authorship. And those were not exact lines from Oregon. They were worse. They were close enough to the language I had once used. The clean language that turned harm into administrative texture. Harm no one had to picture while reading it. I hadn't told anyone at Blackroot about Oregon. Judith's office wouldn't have had reason to embed it in a control script. Even if they had my public record, the civil findings weren't in those terms. The dam didn't just know my voice, it knew the shape of what I had done with it. That was the moment the problem stopped being technical. I wish I could say I got up and left anyway. That some instinct bigger than pride kicked in and saved me. But the rule about not leaving the control room during active countdown had by then become part of the air I was breathing. Not because I trusted the rule, and because the room had made itself the only place where anything could still be measured. Outside the door was corridor, stairwell, dark windows, concrete. Inside was the clock, the system, the evidence. I told myself I needed to understand before I moved. That has always been the sentence that gets me hurt. Roland Vickers entered the control room at 1:23 in the morning carrying a thermos with no steam coming off it. I didn't hear the door open over the hum and the hiss. I smelled cold first, the flat outdoor smell of snow and old wool and iron. Then I looked up and he was already halfway across the room, moving carefully, as if he knew exactly where the floor dipped under the rubber matting. He was in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, though that kind of cold can age a face badly. Lean, deep-set eyes, a gray stubble at the jaw, heavy work coat zipped to the throat. No badge, no radio. His boots were wet to the ankle but didn't leave much on the floor. Only a faint dark sheen that dried too fast. He looked at the countdown before he looked at me. "Still ahead of schedule," he said. That alone told me something was profoundly wrong with him or with the room, because no sane operator walked into that display and spoke like he was commenting on a routine shift handoff. "Who are you?" "Roland Vickers." He unscrewed the thermos cap and poured black coffee into it. It smelled burned and metallic, like it had sat on a warmer for days. "Previous operator." "I wasn't told anyone was on site." "Usually they don't tell either of us." His voice had the roughness of someone who didn't waste it. Minnesota flattened the edges of some words, but there was something else under it, an odd measured caution, as if speech itself had become procedural for him. I asked for credentials. He nodded once toward the terminal, as if that were a fair question and not especially relevant. "Won't find me?" "Why not?" "Reassigned." The printer gave a short burst and fed out a maintenance log. I snatched it before he could. Pump lubrication schedule, door seal pressure, auxiliary drain check, intake icing note, and in the middle of all of it, where nothing in the line items required the term, the word reassignment appeared. Reassignment deferred, reassignment pending, reassignment verified, unrelated entries, same word. Roland watched me read it and didn't bother pretending it meant anything else. "You've been following them," he said. "The rules?" He shrugged one shoulder. "You call them rules. They call them procedures." "Who is they?" At that he actually looked at me, not hostile, not kind. Just tired in a way I recognized from my own face in bad mirrors. "The system that doesn't like correction." Something in my stomach dropped a little farther. I asked him how long he'd been at Blackroot. He said, "Depends which record you mean." I asked if Judith Caro had sent him. He said, "Judith sends notices, the dam sends assignments." That should have ended the conversation. It should have marked him as unstable, delusional, or lying. but nothing about the room felt improved by classifying him that way. He moved through it with a familiarity I didn't have. He never once glanced at the printed rules. He didn't need to. When the printer started, he stepped aside without looking. When the intercom clicked, his jaw set, but he didn't flinch. He knew where not to stand. I asked him the question that mattered. What happens when it reaches 0? He drank from the thermos cap before answering. Depends how much of you is still being treated as external. The hum under the floor rose and fell. For 1 second, I thought I could feel the movement in my own sternum. I need an actual answer. That is one. He set the cap down beside the Dead West console. His fingers were cracked at the knuckles, clean but permanently darkened around the nail beds the way machine workers' hands get. Listen to me, he said. If it prints your name, don't answer it. If it uses your voice, don't argue. If you break a rule, it corrects. If you follow one, it records compliance. Either way, it keeps going. But resistance makes it notice you faster. You're telling me to obey it? No, he said, and there was the shadow in him at last. I'm telling you, obedience looks different from inside. That was the last normal conversation I had. Over the next hour, Roland gave me just enough help to keep me from immediate panic and just enough uncertainty to make every piece of that help poisonous. He showed me where the old paper stock was kept because the printer would jam if it ran dry, and a jam, he said, made the speakers worse. He told me not to stand between the central display and the windows when the countdown dropped below 4 hours. He wouldn't explain why. He said the system preferred symmetrical pressure and then acted as if that sentence made sense. I searched the personnel files for him while he watched the reservoir. You'd know Roland Vickers and current staff. No retired operator record, no contractor credential, no site housing assignment, nothing. But in older maintenance scans, handwritten names blurred in low resolution, I found initials that might have been his beside gate inspections and intake cleanouts. Or might not. The archive wouldn't enlarge cleanly. It smeared the ink into the page the harder I tried to resolve it. At 2:16, the printer produced a new report. Current classification review, intake tower, emergency spillway, north retaining wall. Flow regulator, provisional Dr. Eliza Kincaid. I stared at the title until the words lost shape. Provisional means it hasn't locked, Roland said quietly. I rounded on him. Locked into what? He didn't answer immediately. He looked almost embarrassed for me. You assigned function. That's not an answer either. It may be the only one you get. The intercom clicked. My voice said, acknowledge discrepancy. I said nothing. Follow it, Roland whispered. Why? Because this part isn't for your benefit. I hated him for that sentence. Hated the calm of it. Hated that some small part of me understood what he meant. I swallowed and said into the empty room, discrepancy acknowledged. The printer fed at once. Compliance recorded. Dr. E. Kincaid, provisional flow regulator. The countdown changed nothing. It did not slow. It did not speed. 3 hours, 44 minutes. That's when the inverse truth finally became visible. The rules weren't there to preserve me from the system. They were there to formalize my processing inside it. Each time I complied, the language around me grew tidier, and my classification moved from one category to the next with more certainty. Responsive element, load-bearing unit, provisional flow regulator. The terms weren't dramatic. They were worse. They were administrative. They gave the horror the shape of an approved internal process. When I defied it, the room reacted at once. I tested that with full awareness and no illusion left. At 2:31, the printer listed my name under pressure responsive elements again. Rule said not to acknowledge it. So I picked up the page and said very clearly that is incorrect. The lights dropped to half output. The hum under the floor slammed so hard through my legs that my knees nearly gave out. The hydraulic hiss became a shriek for one long second, not through the speakers, through the walls. Something in the concrete answered it, seemed a deep internal knock like a gate striking limits far below us. Every sealed panel in the room flashed a tiny red diagnostic light all at once. Then silence. Not true silence. The hum returned. The hiss lowered, but the system had corrected. A new page printed. Manual interference detected. Self-classification delayed. Reassignment likelihood increased. Roland didn't say "I told you so," that would have been almost human. He only watched me with a kind of exhausted pity that made me want to strike him. So I tried the opposite. At 2:46, my voice came through the intercom again and said, "Stand at center display." I did. The printer answered. Positional confirmation accepted. Pressure alignment improved. The floor vibrated up through the arches of my feet. The sensation was hideous in its precision, not pain, not exactly. It more like being included in a mechanism too large to imagine, like some internal scale had noticed my weight and balanced around it. I stepped back, breathing too fast. Roland nodded once, as though I had completed a lesson. That's when I stopped pretending this had no relationship to Oregon. You can spend years burying an act inside professional language. You can attend hearings. You can pay settlements you do not call settlements. You can watch photographs of damaged houses move across screens in rooms with bottled water and legal pads, and tell yourself the world is built from shared failure. Permits, projections, weather anomalies, agency pressure, bad incentives. You can divide responsibility until nobody is left holding enough of it to drown. But authorship remains. My name remained, on the report, in the archive, even on the model revision where I had suppressed the flood risk projections enough to secure funding. I had told myself the dam in Oregon would be upgraded before the vulnerable season. I had told myself the lower estimate only bought time. I had told myself no one wanted the honest number because the honest number killed the project. Then the winter runoff had changed. Then downstream neighborhoods had flooded. Not a cinematic wall of water, just enough, just long enough. Enough to rot floors, strip people out of rental housing, ruin possessions, move families into temporary places that became less temporary with each month. Dozens displaced, not dead, which made it easier for some people to file the damage under manageable. The reports stayed under my authorship anyway. Permanent, archived, searchable, irreversible. At Blackroot, I'd in that room with my own voice issuing instructions through the intercom and my name being sorted into structural categories, I finally understood what the system was doing. Not punishing me, not haunting me in any simple moral sense. Correcting the record. A dam structure where data could not be altered, only obeyed. A place where every discrepancy had to be accepted as accurate. A process that treated deviation as human and consistency as mechanical. It was rewriting my role from analyst to component, not because I was present, because I had once decided presence could be abstracted. The countdown was never for the reservoir. It was for the point at which I would no longer be external to the system reading me. At 3:20, snow began blowing hard enough across the windows that the world outside disappeared, and the reservoir and shore and tree line all went white-gray, then dark gray, then nothing at all. Only the reflection of the room remained in the glass, doubled faintly over the countdown. 2 hours, 40 minutes. The storm sealed the place without needing a locked door. I told Roland I was shutting the whole facility down. He didn't try to stop me, not immediately. He only asked, "To save what?" Myself. He considered that, then looked toward the dead west console. That's one interpretation. I went into emergency architecture maps and traced the hard shutdown path. The site was old enough to still have a true kill sequence, not just a software safe mode. Trip turbine load, isolate gate controls, dump non-critical power, preserve structural monitoring on backup. Crude but possible, and every step of it lived behind manual override. Rule 6. I could feel the choice forming long before I made it. Follow the procedures and be integrated completely, cleanly, legibly, or shut the system down and risk something Roland had already named without naming: erasure. No trace, no external record left to contest what happened because I would no longer exist in a form the system had to report on. That should sound like an easy choice. Survival over abstraction. It wasn't, because erasure had a seduction to it. I knew that the instant I saw the shutdown path. I knew what kind of person I was because some part of me thought, good. Let there be no archive. Let it take the authored thing and make it impossible to retrieve. Let there be one clean absence instead of years of searchable guilt. And then, just as quickly, I knew what was rotten in that thought, and disappearance was only another way of avoiding the downstream damage. The families in Oregon had not gotten erasure. They had gotten records with my name on them and walls that swelled and split and leases that were not renewed. I did not get to choose absence as if it were a noble penalty. There was no right answer left, only a shape of harm. The room seemed to know I had arrived there. The hum deepened. The metallic taste in the air thickened until swallowing felt like licking a battery terminal. The printer stayed silent for almost a full minute, which by then was more unnerving than noise. Then Roland crossed to the auxiliary terminal. I thought he was going to block the shutdown path. Instead, he sat, entered credentials I had never seen, and typed his own name into the active field where a component designation should have gone. Roland Vickers. I moved toward him. What are you doing? Load transfer, he said. There is no such function. There is if you stop asking it for permission. The terminal accepted the entry. I know what I saw because I still dream it in the same order. The cursor blinked once under his name. The intercom clicked. A neutral voice, not mine, not his, not quite either, said, "Structural component submitted." Roland took his hands off the keyboard and stood. Then he went completely still. Not dead. Not collapsed. Still. The hum under the floor shifted into a new rhythm and the printer fed one page. Roland Vickers, compensatory baffle, integrated. I grabbed his shoulder. Warm. Real. But the muscles under my hand had gone rigid in a way I have only felt once before, in a sedated patient coming out wrong from anesthesia, where the body is present and the person is somewhere behind a wall you cannot touch. Roland's eyes stayed open. They tracked to the countdown. His mouth moved once, barely. "It buys you interpretation," he whispered. Then nothing. I don't know if what he did was sacrifice, surrender, or compliance so complete it looked like self-destruction. I don't know if he shifted anything away from me or simply demonstrated what final reassignment meant. That's what made it unbearable. He might have been helping me. He might have been helping the dam. In that room, there was no stable difference. I left him standing there. That sentence still sits in me like metal. By 4:50, the reports were coming every 30 seconds. Pressure regulation review, flow alignment status, external classification instability, and then at 5:03, the one I had been dreading without yet seeing. Dr. Eliza Kincaid, flow regulator, not provisional. Active pending final correction. At the same moment, the turbines beneath the floor changed cadence, and my heart answered. One beat heavy, one beat light, one beat heavy, one beat light. I pressed both hands to my chest and felt the mismatch resolve itself to the hum below us. The sensation wasn't symbolic, it was physical. My pulse had found the machinery and decided for a few terrible seconds that it belonged to it. The room swayed. Or I did. I tasted cold iron so sharply I thought I might vomit. Instead, I swallowed it down and opened the shutdown architecture again. My fingertips left damp marks on the keys. 5 hours earlier, I had still believed I was auditing a system. Now the system was measuring how much of me could be incorporated before dawn. When the countdown dropped under 1 hour, the control room started anticipating me. A report printed describing my next movement before I made it. Subject will approach breaker isolation panel. Subject will hesitate due to archive retention concern. Subject will choose manual pathway over software pathway. Each line arrived warm from the printer before the thought had fully settled in my head. I stopped reading them. That helped nothing. My voice came through the intercom every few minutes. Remain in place. Accept current designation. Do not compound discrepancy. The phrasing got closer and closer to the language I had once used in draft reports, the bureaucratic narrowing of harm into manageable terminology. It wasn't threatening me with flood or death, and it was inviting me into the grammar that had already damaged people once before. That was the true contamination. Not blood, not rot, not possession. Administrative language entering the body until the body obeyed it. At 5:27, Roland spoke without moving his head. If you shut it down now, you'll lose the map. I had forgotten he was capable of speech. What map? The one that tells you where you've been put. I stared at him. His eyes were still on the display. His voice sounded scraped thin like air passing through something narrower than a throat. And if I don't? He took a long time to answer. You'll still be there. You'll just understand the terms. I wish he had pleaded. I wish he had lied. Something easier to resist. Instead, he gave me the dilemma in its cleanest form. Follow the rules and be integrated completely, legibly, permanently. Shut the system down and maybe erase the only framework left that could tell me what had been done to me. Both choices preserved the harm in different ways. Both choices cost identity. The countdown reached 12 minutes. That was where the cold open began, though at the time I had no sense of beginnings left, only compression. The floor trembling with false gate movement, the reservoir outside motionless, the panel showing time where water should have been, my name printing under structural components, my hand tearing the page. Tampering will result in reclassification. After that, things narrowed very fast. 6 minutes. I pulled the emergency key from the locked panel beneath the archival terminal. It came free with a sharp, reluctant click, as if it had not been turned in years, and the metal was colder than the room should have allowed. Roland did not react. The printer fed another page. Manual override will result in permanent reassignment. I held the key in my fist until the edges bit into my palm. 5 minutes. My voice on the intercom said, "Proceed to West Console." I didn't. The lights dimmed. The hydraulic hiss rose all around us, in the walls, under the floor, behind the glass, a pressurized breath filling the structure from the inside out. Outside, the snow had thinned just enough for me to see the reservoir again. Still flat, still black, still impossible. 4 minutes. I crossed to the breaker isolation panel. Each step changed the hum under the floor. Not louder, more specific, like walking over organs and learning which one answered which footfall. My ears popped. Pressure climbed behind my eyes. In on the central display, the countdown continued its quiet descent, untouched by everything I had done. 3 minutes. I inserted the key. The panel asked for confirmation, not in plain language, in classification terms. Preserve monitoring and accept integration, or discontinue interpretation and release active designation. That was the real choice. Follow and remain knowable inside the system, or shut it down and risk becoming an absence. I thought of Oregon then, not as maps or liability summaries or hearing exhibits. I thought of one photograph I had tried for years not to remember. A child's rain boots lined up to dry on a porch step above the flood mark. The mud line still visible on the siding, not destroyed, just displaced upward temporarily by someone else's revised number. There are acts you cannot repair, and there are only ways to stop repeating them. 2 minutes. I chose shutdown, not because it promised rescue, it didn't. Because it was the only act left that was not compliance disguised as professionalism. I turned the key and held it. The room dropped into red emergency light. The turbines did not stop. The hum changed frequency so violently my vision blurred. The hydraulic hiss became a full-body vibration. Every printer in the room woke at once, feeding paper in a white storm across the floor. Roland's silhouette remained fixed in the wash of red light. The central display kept counting down, now the brightest thing in the room. 1 minute. The intercom came alive with my own voice, speaking over itself in multiple layers. Reverse correction. Accept designation. Do not remove context. Proceed immediately. I held the key. My arm started to shake from the force running through the panel. The smell of ozone and hot dust flooded the room. Something deep below us released with a booming metallic impact that should have meant gates moving. Massive flow-changing course, the whole structure entering emergency state. Outside, the reservoir did not move. 30 seconds. Roland turned his head. Just enough to look at me. There was gratitude in his face, or warning. I still don't know. 10 seconds. The room was nothing but red light, paper, hum, hiss, and the taste of metal. I could no longer feel my pulse as separate from the machinery. The printer pages slapped against my legs and skated across the floor around my boots. One wrapped briefly around my ankle like a wet leaf before tearing free. 5 seconds. I thought with terrible clarity. And this is what it feels like to become a record. 3 seconds. 2, 1. The countdown reached 0. Nothing happened. No structural failure, no flood, no collapse, no burst of water from the spillways, no blackout, no revelation waiting at the bottom of the clock. Nothing. And because nothing happened, because the body always expects impact after that much anticipation, the absence of it was the worst thing I had ever felt. The room simply exhaled. The hum settled. The hydraulic hiss lowered into its old steady register. The red emergency lights went out one bank at a time. The normal white institutional lighting returned. Outside the windows, the reservoir lay still. The main display went black for a full 5 seconds. Then reservoir metrics came back. Level, inflow, gate status, pressure values, everything clean, everything plausible. Everything exactly where it should have been if the night had never occurred. The printer fed one last page. Only one. I picked it up with a hand I couldn't quite trust. Final classification report. Dr. Eliza Kincaid. Pressure regulation unit active. Below that, in smaller text, one final line. Correction complete. No discrepancies remain. Roland was gone, not fallen, not departed in any way I saw. The place beside the auxiliary terminal was empty. No thermos, no wet prints, no sign a second person had ever been in the room with me. The emergency key was still in my hand. At 6:20 in the morning, the outer access doors unlocked. By 6:40, with stormlight coming thin across the snow and the first trace of phone signal returning on the road south, Judith Caro's office sent a message asking me to upload the completed audit. Nothing in the message referred to anomalies, countdowns, overrides, or a site operator named Roland Vickers. It thanked me for maintaining schedule. I drove all the way back to Duluth before I looked at the final report again. It was still there in my bag, crisp and ordinary as invoice paper. My name where no person's name should have been. Pressure regulation unit active. I searched every record I could reach in the weeks after. Employment files, archived maintenance scans, regional staffing lists, Old engineering memos, there were traces of Blackroot, many of them. There was Judith. There were procurement chains, historical retrofits, winterization budgets. There was no Roland Vickers. There were, however, several internal Blackroot system exports attached to my original assignment packet that I swear I had not seen before I drove north. In one of them, buried in a machine-generated inventory appendix dated before Judith ever emailed me, a line item appeared between auxiliary load monitor and west pressure relay. E. Kincaid, pending. I haven't gone back. I still do consulting, though not on dams. I don't alter outputs, I don't smooth language. If a model says harm, I leave the word harm where it is and let other people decide what to do with it. When clients ask for softer framing, I decline the contract. And there are smaller changes. When storms move in, I know before the forecast does. Not from the air or the light, from pressure. It gathers first behind my ribs and in my ears, in the same way it did in that control room before the intercom clicked. In very quiet places, I still hear the hydraulic hiss, even when every appliance is unplugged and the building is asleep. Sometimes, waking before dawn, I feel a low mechanical hum running through the mattress as steadily as a heartbeat. I don't correct it anymore.